Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. I want to thank you all for taking the time to join us. Our team has prepared the second installment in our cybersecurity series, and we hope that you'll find it very useful as you look to work with your cybersecurity teams on addressing risk. We'll be getting started here shortly, but first I want to call your attention to a few things. First, you should all have a GoToWebinar dashboard on the side of your screen. You can use that to ask questions throughout the webinar. Just drop them into the questions section of the dashboard. Our presentation today should run roughly 45 to 50 minutes, and we'll follow that with a 15-minute Q&A. If you have specific questions about cybersecurity and internal audit at your organization, we're happy to take those conversations offline as well. Second, CPEs will be issued to attendees within 48 hours of the end of the webinar. In order to qualify for your CPE, you will need to attend for the duration of today's session, and you need to complete at least 3 of the poll questions that will be asked during the presentation. Third, I know we have some folks on their first Focal Point webinar today, so I'd like to very briefly introduce who we are. Focal Point is a leading cybersecurity services provider working with Fortune 500 and government agencies. We integrate market-leading consulting, technology integration, and cyber workforce development services to provide end-to-end solutions for security leaders looking to future-proof their companies against threats, changing data protection laws, and growing workforce shortages. You can learn more about our services and solutions and team at focalpoint.com. Before we get started, let me introduce our panel for the afternoon. I'm your host, Emily Swindle, a senior consultant at Focal Point's Risk Advisory team. Our primary cybersecurity SME today is Jeremy Archer, Managing Director of Cyber Defense at Focal Point.
Thanks, Emily. As Emily mentioned, my name is Jeremy Archer. I'm a Managing Director here at Focal Point within our Cyber Defense practice. I lead our red team and penetration testing offensive security efforts. I've been with Focal Point for about 5 years, about 22 years in information technology and security, most recently at a national furniture retailer where I led the cyber defense practice.
Great, thank you. Next, we have Skylar Slaughter, Manager of Cyber Defense at Focal Point.
I think we don't have audio for Skylar, but while we wait, that's okay. Skylar leads our vulnerability management and vulnerability assessment program within cyber defense as well. Working with Gary McIntyre, who will be on our next webinar. Skylar has been with Focal Point, I think about 6 months or so.
That's correct. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks. You're welcome.
And then finally, we have Donnell Martinez, Director of Risk Advisory, who will be bringing his internal audit expertise. This panel has a range of expertise in different aspects of internal audit and cybersecurity, and I'm excited to hear their thoughts during today's discussion and hope you get some insights here that help you as you work to integrate cybersecurity and internal audit efforts. For the late joiners, just a quick reminder to drop your questions into the questions section of the GoToWebinar dashboard, and our panelists will answer them during the Q&A portion of the webinar. And with that, let's get started. Now, as we learned in part 1 of this webinar, the idea for this series began when our team learned more about the Equifax data breach. We wanted to take a deeper dive to determine how internal audit can help identify potential weaknesses from a cybersecurity perspective. To recap, you will see the vulnerabilities from the Equifax case on your screen. For today's webinar, we will be touching on the unpatched server and the unencrypted usernames and passwords to determine how a pen testing program can help mitigate these vulnerabilities. So getting into our main topics for today, Skylar, can you tell us more about vulnerability management and how it differs from vulnerability assessment?
Absolutely, and hopefully you can hear me now. So a vulnerability assessment is just one key piece of the larger program that is vulnerability management for an enterprise. So within vulnerability management, there are a number of processes that create kind of a cycle that is ongoing, repeatable processes that include everything from the assessment itself scanning and discovery of assets and different vulnerabilities, and then seeing those vulnerabilities through their entire life cycle from their discovery until their ultimate remediation or mitigation. So beyond just identifying actual vulnerabilities with a point-in-time assessment, it looks typically at all in-scope applications, systems, et cetera, on a weekly or monthly basis, and then includes things such as triaging of vulnerabilities to prioritize remediation and tracking that remediation, identifying compensating controls. All of that goes into a comprehensive vulnerability management program that addresses the vulnerabilities in addition to just discovering them.
Great, thank you, Skylar. And then Jeremy, so if a company doesn't have these processes or departments in place, how or when should they implement them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think really all organizations can have some type of vulnerability management program. It can be extremely informal. Maybe if you're just starting, you don't have a lot of experience with it, or maybe a particularly small organization, it can be very informal, typically very easy to implement, maybe highly manual in those cases, all the way up to the very mature organizations that have potentially many even departments that are each addressing one of these circles that Skylar spoke to. And so really we see organizations, they really exist on a maturity spectrum, from very, very immature, very informal to highly mature, highly advanced, oftentimes staffed by many, many people. On kind of the immature spectrum or end of the spectrum, really it can be very informal, highly manual. Something just really as simple as inventorying a list of the systems, people, processes that exist within your organization, the software that you're using, and then manually comparing that with known vulnerabilities that might exist within the software, the processes that you're using. On the other end of the spectrum, of course, very, very advanced, highly automated often, typically large numbers of people, both on red teams and blue teams, working together to identify vulnerabilities. So it can be very, very different depending on what the organization looks like.
Got it, okay. So then I guess who would typically be involved with the different vulnerability assessment or vulnerability teams?
Yeah, so we really have two main teams that participate in this type of work, and then a third team that's created by virtue of these two teams coming together. So on the slide here that Emily's presenting, on the far end of the spectrum, we have the red team. And you can kind of think of the red team as the people who are answering the question, what vulnerabilities exist within my organization? And so oftentimes that team is made up of penetration testers, red teamers, sometimes they're referred to just simply as red teamers, people running vulnerability scans, people doing social engineering. Their main job is to answer the question, what vulnerabilities exist within this environment? On the opposite end of the spectrum, so if you think of the red team, if you think of like a football team, right? The red team is the offense. They're attempting to move the position along in some way. The blue team, however, is defensive. They're attempting to protect the environment from compromise. And so while the red team may emulate a particular threat actor, the blue team is defending the organization from that threat actor. And so typically that team will be made up with personnel in the Security Operations Center, incident responders, firewall, maybe managers, IPS managers, those individuals who are taking administrative ownership of the security controls that exist within the organization. It can be everybody all the way to people that are installing patches on servers. For example, with the Equifax breach, could have been a systems administrator who would have been responsible for installing the appropriate patch to the Apache Struts vulnerability. And so the blue team is the defensive team. And the red team then exists for the sake of helping the blue team. So the red team is going to attempt to help that blue team identify those vulnerabilities and say, okay, this is the vulnerability we found. I'm going to provide that to you in some sort of manner that you can then track it and run it through your entire vulnerability management lifecycle. And then the blue team, of course, respond to that, implement remediation or critical compensating controls. When we talk about a purple team, then we're really talking about the blue team and that red team coming together to form a new kind of collaborative team or collaborative type engagement. One example that I like to use when we talk about purple teams is the testing of antivirus software. A blue team maybe has implemented an antivirus solution into the organization, and they want to know the efficacy of that. It's not good enough simply to install it and then cross your fingers and hope it works. So the blue team could say to the red team, hey, we want you to actually attempt to test this, bypass our antivirus software, and we want to see then how the antivirus software responds. Does it send logs? Does it appropriately catch the bypass or find the malware that you're using? And then as a result of that, then the blue team can tune that software or that process or simply educate people so that their defenses become better. And so that purple team is a collaboration between blue and red to improve the overall posture of the organization.
And Skylar, so as we're assessing and auditing these areas of our organization, so when I look at these teams, what am I looking at? What kind of capabilities, tools, technologies am I expected to see to make sure these teams have the abilities to do their job in a proper way?
So on the blue team side, as Jeremy mentioned, it's all about having the best defensive posture possible. So what you're looking for is a combination of tools that support monitoring of the entire enterprise and all in-scope systems, whether that's intrusion detection and firewalls, network monitoring, application logs. And a lot of times what a SOC will rely on is a single tool that aggregates all that information, all those logs, and gives meaning to the logs by setting alerts and thresholds on all the information that it's ingesting in something called a SIM. So that is usually the powerhouse command center type tool that is driving the SOC analysis of all of those threats that are incoming to the organization, whether they originate from the outside or within the organization. So on the blue team side, that's primarily what you're looking for. I think that Jeremy can probably speak to tools on the red team side.
Yeah. On the red team side, there's a variety of different types of tools that are available. Some that are just really automated tools that you can install into an environment and say, okay, go do your thing and attempt to find all of the vulnerabilities that you're aware of, and these are the systems that I want you to scan, for example. Oftentimes you might hear those referred to as vulnerability scanners, or I think of Nessus, Qualys, Rapid7. There's a variety of different types of products out there that are just general vulnerability assessment tools. And then, of course, there's highly specialized tools for very particular types of applications, everything from web application scanning tools to very complex things like SAP analysis tools, things like that. So it varies highly depending on the type of technology that's in use. And then, of course, there's a lot of manual work that goes into assessments as well. People, for example, tend to be a little bit more of a loose cannon. So they have to, in social engineering engagements, we have to be able to respond to people really in kind of a manual way. So.
All right. So then why are vulnerability assessments important, or how do they really add value to the company?
Yeah, great question. So really, when we talk about vulnerability assessments, what we're really describing this is the process of identifying risk or identifying potential threats to an organization. It's just really difficult to protect ourselves from things that we're not aware of. And most organizations are in that land in some way or another. They just don't have a good grasp of all of the threats that face their organization. As I've mentioned a couple times, those vulnerabilities can exist not only within our technology, as in the case of the Equifax breach, but they can exist within our people and our processes as well. And so a vulnerability assessment program or a vulnerability assessment engagement is really attempting to identify what those are. And so you can think of the red team as those people who are going to help you answer the question, what should I be worried about? What should keep me up at night? Nobody likes being kept up at night, but it's better than not knowing the risks to our organization. If we don't know about it, we simply can't respond to it. And so a vulnerability assessment program is really intended to help organizations understand those risks, so then they can make an informed, risk analysis decision or data-driven decision on how they should respond to that. Not all findings are going to pose an equal risk to an organization. And so really being able to help auditors particularly understand what those risks are, understand what those vulnerabilities are, and then of course organizations can make a determination how they want to respond to that. They can oftentimes just choose, say, hey, we're going to accept the risk associated with that vulnerability. The overall risk is very, very low, maybe because it can't be exploited or the likelihood of it being exploited is very, very low, or maybe the impact is very low and therefore it doesn't pose a significant concern for the organization. But really in the end, what we're trying to do is help organizations understand the vulnerabilities that exist. So then folks like Audit can determine how are we going to respond to that.
Great, thank you. Okay, viewers, you should now be seeing your first poll question. Please take a moment to read and respond. All right, thank you everyone for participating. You should now be seeing how you and your peers answered. And for those of you who selected the red team, you are correct. All right, so then going into an auditor's perspective, Jeremy, how do the blue and red teams intersect with internal audit?
Yeah, I think the thing that kind of comes to mind again is that helping audit understand the risks that are facing the organization. Frequently, what I would say we kind of observe is that simply a list of findings or vulnerabilities can sometimes be presented to the blue team, and there exists oftentimes a communication gap between what the overall risk of those vulnerabilities are to the organization. And so we might not always, I hope that whoever you're working with in terms of red team, offensive security, penetration testing are doing a good job of communicating that. But oftentimes, as we look across the landscape of reports and things like that, sometimes that information is just simply not communicated well. But red teams should be communicating to audit what these risks are. And one of the things that I like to say is that clarity should precede agreement. And oftentimes there's just a real lack of clarity when it comes to the findings that are reported in terms of their actual risk to the organization. And so we highly encourage audit to speak with red teams so that they can understand. Sometimes speaking to the blue teams is fine too, but somebody should be able to communicate to audit, this is the risk to the organization as a result of this particular vulnerability. In addition, I think one of the value adds that penetration testing or vulnerability assessments can bring to the table, where maybe just simple scanning tools and things like that cannot, is really that AV deployment example that I spoke about earlier when we talked about the red team and the blue team kind of merging together. When blue teams implement particular technologies, the efficacy of those technologies is often unknown. And so the red team has the ability to evaluate things like that and then can report those particular findings as well to audit and say, okay, this is great that this is implemented, but it wasn't implemented properly. And so, or it may have been implemented in a particular way that is able to be bypassed, for example. In fact, I think we have a slide on that would be helpful. So when we use security testing or penetration testing or vulnerability assessments to analyze the vulnerabilities within the organization, audit may come back and say, okay, this organization is using antivirus. I'm going to check a box. That's great. Things are well. And yet, penetration testing and vulnerability assessments can actually examine the efficacy of those things. And it may turn out sometimes that the efficacy of them isn't quite as high as what we expected. So, Emily, if you can go on to the next slide, I can kind of show an example of that as it relates to antivirus solutions. Or maybe you're on that slide and I'm just not seeing it. Well, while she's working towards that, I'll just talk to it. So as an example, we recently conducted a antivirus efficacy test within an organization, and one of the configuration parameters that can be used during the configuration of the antivirus solution is a folder or directory whitelisting. And what that does is it tells the antivirus software, don't worry about this directory. If there's a file in this particular directory that's a concern, don't report it, don't worry about it. Just go ahead and skip it. And so in that particular assessment, we found, for example, a particular directory that was whitelisted. And as a result of that, can deploy malware or software to that directory so that we can completely bypass the antivirus solution entirely. And so in that case, it would be as though the solution wasn't implemented at all, or the antivirus software wasn't being used at all.
Great, thank you. So then what about rogue Wi-Fi access points? Is that something that internal audit should be concerned with?
Yeah, that's another great question. I would say yes, for sure. And again, getting back to the overall question of understanding the actual risk to the organization is very important. We might say, okay, there's rogue access points, or there is a rogue access point, or we should be aware of rogue access points. All of those things are absolutely true. And yet, understanding why that's true is maybe a little bit of a more interesting question. And so if we think about why rogue access points are a problem for an organization, we can deploy a rogue access point in an assessment that we're doing. And you might think, we all know about our network names, where we click the little Wi-Fi icon and we see all of the networks that appear. We go to our phone and we see all of the names of the networks, and people like to name them in all kinds of clever and funny ways. We might have focal point Wi-Fi, and that's a valid, sanctioned, real network within your environment. Malicious parties can name their access points anything that they want as well. And so it becomes very difficult to determine which is the real and which is the fake. And so in the event that there's a malicious access point that's deployed within an environment that's fake, right, that exists and is under the control of a malicious party, they can name that whatever they want. And as a result, Danelle, you might sit down at your computer and say, okay, I need to connect to Focal Point's Wi-Fi, and you click the list, and you see a list of all of the Focal Point Wi-Fi networks, and then click one of those. Well, if that happens to be the rogue access point that is under the control of the malicious party, now we've created a communication channel between your computer and a system that I essentially control. And as a result of that, we can capture data that comes to us. So a quick example of that might be authentication. So maybe you have to authenticate to your wireless network at Focal Point. So you click the Focal Point and it pops up and it asks you for your usernames and passwords. In the event that you're connected to the corporately sanctioned network, no problem, that's fine. You're going to continue on as normal. But in the event that you've connected to our malicious access point, now we have intercepted that username and password, and we can use it then to access your corporate network. And so really understanding the full spectrum of vulnerabilities that can face an organization is going to be really helpful for audit. And sometimes that can occur through things like threat modeling or just simple lists of potential vulnerabilities that need to be addressed on a per technology basis.
Great. So then how can internal audit help to ensure the strength of the security of the perimeter?
Yeah, so I think one way is to understand that the perimeter has changed. There was a time when the perimeter was simply our internet connection. And we all can think back to those days when IT felt very simple. A lot of organizations didn't even have an internet connection. When they got an internet connection, they thought, well, we need to get a firewall. Brett talked about firewall security a little bit in the last webinar. So if you haven't seen that, you can go look at that. But really, the perimeter was pretty simple. It was the internet, and then us, and the perimeter was that connection between the internet and our corporate environments. And it's a whole new world now. Now the perimeter is more complex. We have, of course, the internet. Our internet connection is a perimeter, but cloud services are a potential perimeter, whether you're using AWS or GCP or Azure. Our cloud environments or our software as a service or infrastructure as a service become perimeters as well. And so understanding that the perimeter isn't just that one internet connection anymore. Now it's all of these cloud services that we have distributed across the internet. Our perimeter can be individuals or people as well. Phishing is just skyrocketed in terms of success and efficacy of accessing the internal environment, especially as people have moved to work from home. We've probably all got emails, phishing emails, letting us know about our stimulus check or about COVID or something like that. And of course, the individual that's targeted at individual people. And so people can be an aspect of the perimeter as well. We have the wireless networks, which we just spoke about. When we do wireless assessments, one of the questions that we attempt to think through is, where is this wireless network accessible from? Can I just sit in the parking lot and connect to your wireless network? We may not think about the wireless network as being an aspect of the perimeter, but if we define the perimeter as that line between the bad guys and us, wireless and our parking lots become an aspect of the perimeter. And then, of course, physical buildings are a perimeter as well. We do regular assessments of physical buildings where we attempt to either socially engineer our way into a building. Again, that kind of points to the people aspect of the perimeter, but also the security controls that exist, whether they be door lock, RFIDs, things like that. So really, I think audit can help organizations understanding that when we talk about perimeter, it means just much, much more than it used to mean.
Great. So then, are there any best practices that internal audit should know or be aware of?
Yeah, so when we talk about vulnerability assessments or vulnerability scanning, and this probably applies to penetration testing as well, there's several things to keep in mind. I think the place where we see most organizations get it wrong is probably in the scoping process. I frequently use an analogy of describing organizations as chains and not buckets. And so we might think of a vulnerability assessment that happens, but it's only going to happen for a very small subset of the overall assets of the organization. That could be something like well, these are the assets that are in scope for us from a PCI perspective, or these are the assets that are in scope for us from a HIPAA perspective, or something like that. And so organizations are going to be tempted to say, well, we're only going to do testing on this subset. And that can be helpful under some circumstances. And yet we want to be cautious about that, because again, to that kind of the buckets versus chains, we can say, well, a bucket, taking a bucket approach, we'll say, well, these systems over here exist within a silo. They're separated off. They're a separate bucket. But finance here is a different bucket, and IT is a different bucket. And so we only care about this. And organizations are really more like links in a chain. And so if I'm able to compromise one of those assets, or one of those departments, or one of those systems, I'm frequently going to have opportunity to connect to the others, and that can be through people or even processes as things work through different workflows that might exist within the organization, and of course through technology. Just because subset of assets are tested within a particular vulnerability assessment doesn't mean that there's not physical or logical connections to other technology assets within the organization. And so scoping is huge. It's just super important. You have to do comprehensive testing. The other thing too that I would probably note is getting the position right and testing from the right perspective. Oftentimes if we think kind of back again to the old days, right, where there was the bad guys on the internet and then our corporate network, and the bad guys are here and the good guys are here, and there's a very clear line. That's just not the case anymore, especially with things like social engineering, where it's very, very easy often to penetrate that perimeter and get access to the corporate network. And so we encourage organizations to not only do vulnerability testing and penetration testing from that outside perspective, from the internet, but also to do it from the internal perspective, to do it from inside the network. Oftentimes organizations are in some way breached. They don't know it. They still need to be aware of what are the security of vulnerabilities that exist within my corporate network that are potentially a risk to us from the perspective of somebody who's already compromised the environment. So I would point to those two things as being particularly important. Of course, there's 100 more items. One of which comes to mind is having updated tools for detecting vulnerabilities. I think back to the Equifax breach, where there was a pretty significant delay in the time between when that vulnerability was first disclosed on the Apache HTTP server and when it was patched or actually compromised by the malicious party at Equifax. And so it's possible that vulnerability was just simply unknown to the organization as they went about looking for vulnerabilities. And so having really updated tools, good, sometimes you might refer to these are called updated plugins. Having updated plugins or updated tools is going to be really important for identifying the most timely or most recent vulnerabilities that have been disclosed.
Great, thank you. So Donnell, from an auditor's perspective, what do you look at to assess vulnerability strategies?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. And as Emily was, we keep still getting the glitch that we see the poll. So to go back to the presentation, so as you keep working on that, I'm going to keep answering the question. So what we see is it's two things in general that I would expect. One is we talked the last time about hardening standards or MSB checks or anything else. So we will expect that there is an alignment between all of those controls and vulnerability scanning. So if I will expect the hardening standards to be at a better precision, I will anticipate the scanning of the vulnerabilities will provide a shorter list of results. And then on the other side, go back to the process, right? I will be very interested on understanding when a vulnerability scanning happens and vulnerability is identified, what is being done by the company to make sure it's remediated? Does it go further than just recording it? And then if it's, for example, an end of life technology situation or anything else, I will be very interested to recognize how efficiently and how quickly my organization is able to address those issues and make sure they can go through it. So I'll focus on that process.
So I think there is a technical glitch. I'm going to try launching your next poll question. So if you could just please take a second to read and respond. All right, and then I'm going to share the results so you can see how you and your peers answered. And if you answered the Apache vulnerability, you are correct.
Quick aside on that, Emily. We, as a penetration testers and vulnerability assessors, we frequently see that particular vulnerability in the wild as well. And so I think it was 2018, February or so of 2018 that vulnerability was first disclosed. We're several years later now here and still seeing that same vulnerability.
It's very interesting. Thank you.
And as I had said, we still see your easy last poll, Emily, just want to let you know. You wouldn't see the presentation.
Sorry about that. Not showing on my screen.
And as Emily continues, I think, Jeremy, the next topic was kind of find what difference is between a pen testing and vulnerability assessment. Maybe you can go through it and talk to us about it.
Yeah, this is a question that comes up fairly often. When we think about a vulnerability assessment, what we're really thinking about is just identifying or finding or discovering vulnerabilities that exist within the environment. It really doesn't include a lot of information that's going to be helpful for an organization to understand the risks associated with those vulnerabilities. And so frequently, I think we'll see a vulnerability assessment and there might be, a large list of findings and they're just kind of listed out and, categorized oftentimes by the severity of those vulnerabilities. And it can be really important. We just encourage every organization, do vulnerability assessments. They are important. What they don't do, however, is typically communicate the risk of those vulnerabilities. And so there can be a little bit of a discrepancy between a severity rating that's associated with the vulnerability and the actual risk to the organization of the vulnerability. And so we sometimes might see, a high severity vulnerability has very, very low risk to an organization, or vice versa. Maybe a medium or low severity vulnerability could have a potentially significant risk. And so what a penetration test is going to do is it's actually going to attempt to communicate some of that risk. And so if we go back to the Equifax breach as an example, that Apache Struts vulnerability could have been discovered via a vulnerability assessment, and it would have just appeared as a line item on a list potentially. What I think is important to understand with a penetration test, however, is that a penetration test is actually going to attempt to exploit that vulnerability. So we're going to attempt to gain access to the environment and then demonstrate what's what can come of this? What data can be retrieved? What information can be disclosed? What information could potentially be manipulated? And so when we talk about penetration testing, it's helpful just to think about it in terms of they're going to emulate a malicious actor in order to demonstrate the actual impact, the actual risk to the organization, whereas a vulnerability assessment typically does not.
So then what about social engineering? I know you mentioned that earlier. So is that a typical penetration testing type?
Yeah, absolutely. We typically talk about penetration testing as existing across three categories. So on this slide here, represented as people, processes, and technologies. And the reality is these are blurred. They're helpful categories, but in practice, social engineering, to use that example, since you had asked about that, social engineering typically will cross at least a couple of these categories. And so to that process of identifying vulnerabilities, we might send a social engineering email or a phishing email to a particular group of people. That's going to actually test a few things. It might test their spam filters. Is it effective? Did the email, the phishing email, bypass their critical controls or their security controls and actually land in that user's inbox, so they even have the ability to click the link and go do something they're not supposed to? How did the users respond? Did they notify IT and say, hey, I got this phishing email? We often think of, when we think about the perimeter or people as an aspect of the perimeter, it's important to remember that not only are they a potential risk, but they're also they can be a potential asset. If the processes exist for people to be able to report spam or report phishing emails, technology could respond to that, and they could just block that or remove that malicious message from everybody's inbox. And then, of course, processes and technology exist as potential vulnerability areas as well. We're probably most familiar with the technology aspects as we think about vulnerability assessments, vulnerability management, patch management programs, things like that. But we really want to take a comprehensive view of the entire organization as vulnerabilities exist across all three of these categories. In fact, one example I would give was recently we were conducting a social engineering physical test against a bank. They had approximately, I think, 6 branches, and the objective was to compromise the physical buildings, the physical branches, and gain access to the computer room. And so, in anticipation of this work, my team's incredibly creative. They're super smart. They think of all kinds of clever things that, of course, I could never think of. But what they decided to do was to spin up a fake employee verification portal that looked like it was owned by the bank. And so they took their own pictures, they made fake badges, they put some bio information on this website that they created. I think it was something like employeevalidation.nameofthebank.com or something like that. In anticipation of going to the bank and just suspecting that somebody at the branch was going to say, who are you? I don't know you. Why are you here? And in fact, that's exactly what happened. And so in this case, it was 2 parties. They went to the bank. They said, hey, we're from IT. We need to get access to your computer room. We're doing some maintenance. And of course, the branch manager said right away, well, I don't know who you are. And they said, oh, well, it's okay. Just look us up on the employee validation site. And of course, directed them to the website that they had created, pulled up the site, typed in their name, saw their picture, said, okay, well, looks like you do work here after all. Go ahead and you can go into the computer room. And so we want to be mindful of how our people, that was a failure in people, but it was a failure in process as well, that there wasn't an already existing validation, employee validation system or some sort of prior notification. And then, of course, technology as well. So these risks really exist across all 3 of these categories.
And you got in, and I'm assuming you left some kind of toys behind after you left the facility, right? Yeah,
toy is the right word. We've got lots of kind of James Bondish stuff where they can plug in some sort of device and then just have permanent access after they leave.
sorry. So then why would an auditor look at the pen test results?
Yeah, so to the pen test results, again, we're really attempting to communicate risk to an organization. Sometimes this information is extremely technical. It can be really hard and challenging to understand, you know, what's the actual impact. And so I think of one example where we might see a high, where well, here is an example, misconfigured Active Directory permissions. That might mean a lot of different things, and you're going to have to get a lot more information in order to be able to respond to that. And so really we encourage auditors and really everybody who's responsible for information security to have those conversations, to talk with the penetration testing team, or that red team, so that they can understand overall, really more comprehensively, not just a criticality rating, like in this case, the severity rating of critical versus high, but really understanding the potential impact of those vulnerabilities. So for example, in this case, mountable NFS share is a high, but if you think of what that is, it's like a drive on your computer that's connected to the network. There might be usernames and passwords for other important systems that are available on that mountable NFS share that of course could be then chained and used in a more malicious way than even some of these criticals.
So Jeremy, when you know, auditors were trusted advisors to our organization. So when the board, for example, or management asks us questions, how do we extract the information from a pen test report? How do you suggest we start so we can provide that information that they're looking for?
That's a great question. I'm just going to really encourage a lot of communication, a lot of good question asking. Probably the most important question I think you can go to is asking the question of the red team or the blue team when you come to a particular vulnerability, is the so what question. What impact does this have on the organization? You know, what would happen if the bad guys actually took advantage of this? Again, some of these things are really technical. Emily just pulled up the severity versus risk one here. This is a medium. But if we ask the so what question, it becomes significantly more important in my mind. So it's a little small, at least on my screen. I've got, you know, old man eyes here, but this is a medium. And yet, in the event that this were actually to be exploited, the username and password for the individual connected to the VPN system would become accessible to the malicious party. And so, even though this is classified as a medium in this case, if we exploited it and we asked the so what question, the answer is anybody who exploited this vulnerability could gain the username and password of all of the people that are connected to that VPN system, which is essentially about the same as opening up the front door to your organization. I don't need to be on your corporate network anymore. I don't need to attempt to do any phishing. I can just visit this URL. Because of this vulnerability exists, I can then collect the username and password from this blob of text there at the bottom, and then log into the VPN system. That to me feels like that's not a medium. The so what is actually pretty significant. Maybe it's a critical, maybe it's a high. So having those conversations, I think, is really important.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, you know, as auditors, we would typically sample those higher critical ones and maybe look past some of those medium severities. So knowing to look at the lower rated items is definitely good to know. So.
Yep.
All right. So then viewers, we have our last poll question. You should be seeing that on your screen now. Just please read and respond.
I don't know if others saw it. I saw it pop up and disappeared, but maybe others can see it. Oh, it looks like that poll closed, Emily. You may need to reopen it if that's possible.
Yeah. Sorry, everyone, give us 1 second.
Emily, would it be okay if I just answered a couple of these questions while we work on that?
Yeah, sure. I think that we're just having a glitch in the system, so we're not going to answer that third poll question, but everyone will still receive their CPE.
Great. I think one of the questions that did pop up here was, what are some examples of insider vulnerabilities? I mentioned that the mountable NFS shares as a potential vulnerability in the event that we're not practicing good authentication mechanisms on our file systems. That could be one example of where an insider could gain access to systems that they shouldn't have access to if the proper security controls aren't implemented. I would say probably the one that we see the most commonly is just really bad passwords. It just seems like, as kind of a industry, we can't get past the fact that we all hate passwords and we just pick really bad ones. You know, I'm sure that some of you guys have, even on the call here, Trump 2020 or Biden 2020 or something. We just see stuff like that all the time. And so people tend to use very common passwords over and over again. And so that would be another example of what I would point to as a real insider vulnerability that we see often. We can collect, malicious parties can collect password hashes very easily if they're on your internal network. And if you're using a very weak password, that password can be cracked typically fairly quickly, oftentimes within minutes, sometimes 24 hours, something like that. So that would be one example of some insider threats.
I think another question is, how can automation be integrated into the vulnerability management process? Sure.
Yeah, good. I had mentioned a couple vulnerability automation tools earlier that are really helpful. Nessus, Tenable Nessus is example, Rapid7, Qualys. A lot of these tools are intended to be used in a highly automated fashion. So, you know, give it a target and say, go out and find all of these vulnerabilities and then report back on those vulnerabilities, so then I can respond to them, either deem them false positives or implement compensating controls or just simply remediate them. And so automation can be extremely helpful. Some of these things are just highly time consuming if you're going to do them manually. So I would definitely encourage using some automated tools, and also understanding that those automated tools aren't perfect. They can miss things. There's some things that automated tools just aren't good at finding, that really just require some good old-fashioned elbow grease.
There is another question. Have you guys ever identified zero-day vulnerabilities in your experience? And if yes, how?
I'm sorry, Donnell, can you repeat that question?
Yes, if you have identified zero-day vulnerabilities.
Oh.
And if so, how?
Yeah, actually, we had a team member who identified a zero-day vulnerability in a content management system on a web application that's probably 10 years old, and just found it maybe 3 weeks ago. And so a CVE will be issued for that here soon. It's actually remarkable how often that occurs, especially on fairly infrequently used software solutions. So when you have something that's very, very common, everybody's testing it, everybody's conducting work against it, those 0 days tend to be less frequent. But in the event that a software solution is being used that isn't supported or isn't commonly used, isn't popular, we tend to see that more often.
Mm. And what are the most commonly vulnerabilities that you see more frequently?
Mm-hmm. I would say software patching just continues to be a big problem. Skylar's nodding her head. She lives in that world. Patching is just hard. It can be very complex. There's a high fear of what happens if we install this patch and the system goes down. And we understand that in some ways there is a little bit of a tension between business owners who want their applications to be available 24/7. They want them to be reliable. They want them to be speedy, and security. So in some ways, there's this built-in tension between availability and security. And as a result of that tension, I think organizations will often be hesitant to apply software patches in a timely manner. We see that especially, I think, as it relates to mission-critical type systems, servers, things like that. Generally, people are a little bit more apt to do that on workstations. So I would point to probably patch management as just a really significant problem across the board still.
And if you see, quick question, so if you see, continuing on that, let's say there is this system that's reached end of life, right? So there are no more patches. What do you think is the best suggested way to approach it, to fix it soon, quickly?
Yeah, good question. So typically we're going to always recommend that you remove the system, decommission it, take it offline, replace it with something that's supported. We did testing recently on a very large manufacturing organization, and they are highly dependent on end-of-life software. It's just built into some of these systems, and they can't replace it. And so in those instances, compensating controls become really, really important. It might mean moving it to a segmented network that is inaccessible. It might mean implementing additional security controls on those systems. So for example, maybe deploying some sort of endpoint protection solution that's above and beyond your normal practice. It could just simply mean taking it off of the network and air gapping it and saying, okay, this system is vulnerable. We know it has problems. It's end of life. We can't do anything about that. So at the very least, let's disconnect it from the network, and it can only worry about controlling this assembly line, for example.
Thanks. And I think we reached the top of the hour, Emily. I think you're on mute.
All right.
I think you're on mute.
I think.
Sorry, guys, can you hear me now?
That's okay.
There you go. Yeah.
You can.
There we go. Okay. Yeah, so if we didn't answer any of your questions today, you can email us at info@focalpoint.com. And then before we wrap up, Skylar, if you could give a brief introduction for our next webinar.
Oh, I'm sorry. So our next webinar will be featuring my colleague, Gary McIntyre. He also works closely with Jeremy. He heads up the blue team side of cyber defense, and he will be talking about the SOC more specifically. So we touched on that a little bit when we talked about the blue team earlier, but we'll be delving more into that in the next session.
Great, thank you. And as a quick reminder, we'll be sending everyone the link to the recorded version of this webinar tomorrow. And again, even though the system glitched, you will be receiving CVEs for this session today. And we hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.